Okay, thank you very much. Congratulations again to all the award winners. I think you'll find that we've saved some of the best speakers for this last session. I'm honored to be able to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Byran Koon, who has served as the director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management since 2011. Before that, he worked for Walmart for 5 years as operations manager and director of emergency management. Prior to that, he also worked at the White House military office for 7 years, where he was a watch officer in the President's Emergency Operations Center while on active duty for the United States Navy. He's currently the vice president of the National Emergency Management Association. And I think you'll find that because of his experiences here with emergency management in the private sector, in the federal government and state government, that he really has some unique perspectives on communicating risk. Welcome, Mr. Byran Koon.
Thank you, Max. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Orlando. Welcome to Florida. Glad to have you here. Since a good chunk of the people left in the room at this point actually work for the Florida Division of Emergency Management, I'm just going to do a staff meeting at this point, if you'll humor me. All right, I've got my iPad up here. This is a big room. If you want to ask me any questions along the way, I've got Twitter opened up on it. You can go to hashtag AskBK. That's ASKBK. If you want to tweet a question, I'll take a look at it periodically, and you feel free to ask me something that I've talked about here today. I can elaborate, or if you want to compliment my tie or whatever, that's the way to do it. The title of my presentation was Communicating Risk. These things work, several months in advance. They ask you, what do you want to talk about? I have no idea what I'm going to talk about several months in advance. So we usually make up something fairly generic sounding and then hope to try to make it at least similar to what my title was as we come about. As you heard Craig say this morning, he doesn't know what he's going to talk about until after his first cup of coffee in the morning. I too am similarly motivated by liquid, but mine tends to lead me to have lesser decipherable handwriting on there. So you may discover that at some point I stare at this thing and try to figure out what the heck I'm trying to talk about at some point. But it's been a great session, great conference so far this week, and it's driven a lot of the ideas that I'll discuss here today. And I think you'll even hear some of the things I've talked about. Chris Landsea will talk about as we talk about historical hurricanes, and Dr. Meadows will talk about as we talk about flood insurance. But I'm basing this on two precepts. One is that most people do not want to die in a hurricane. And the second one is those of us in this room do not want people to die in a hurricane. So those are my two underlying fundamentals for this whole presentation, is that we both have the same goal in mind. We don't want people to die in hurricanes. The fact is that today we have most of the information necessary to make that happen. We know when hurricanes are coming. We know what the impact is going to be. We're not completely all of the way there yet, but we've made significant progress, certainly far better than we were 10 years ago, 50 years, 100 years ago. When Chris talks about some of the historical hurricanes and you hear about the number of people that died in those storms, today we are far, far better than we ever have been in the past. And we're going to continue to make more strides going forward. The technology will get better, the forecasting will get better, our communication channels will get better, and so we're going to do much better jobs in the future. But it's going to take a little bit of work. We're going to have to continue to strive to get there, to get to that point where nobody dies in hurricanes and where we can reduce the impact of property damage during hurricanes. So our work is cut out for us. So what are the things that we can do to get there? And so I've got 4 ideas today to discuss about some practical things I think that we can do to legitimately help us take those next steps. One, and I'll come back and elaborate on all of these. One is speaking a language that our customers can understand and do it in a communications media that they're going to utilize. Second, take advantages of change. And there's lots of different changes that can help drive a climate that will make it more conducive to have those conversations. Third, influence the public perception of the issue and drive the customer demand for this type of information. And fourth, collaborate and in some cases, get over ourselves. Get over the parochialism that some of us have in this business. Get over that so that we can move on and get some things done. So the first part of it, speaking a language that our customers can understand. Orlando is a huge destination for conferences, for conventions. There's, at any given time, a dozen or 2 dozen of them happening at this hotel, all the other hotels around here, the convention center. It's a great place for that. So you always have groups in town working on issues. And if you took out the word hurricane and replaced it with something else, they're having very similar conversations. How do we convince our customer, how do we convince the public to do whatever it is we want them to do, whether it's to stop getting fat or to quit smoking or to buy more lawn tractors or whatever the case may be? All of them are having similar conversations and trying to get to that same thing we're doing, which is to get everybody to understand what our message is and take the action. And all of them are probably having very similar. That's so simple. Why are they not driving our lawn tractor? It's obviously the best lawn tractor in the business. They should be driving it. Well, how do we get them to that point? Same thing we're saying. It's so obvious that hurricanes can cause this damage. Why are people not taking those protective actions? So I think there are some things that we can learn from all of each other on helping to do that. How do we do the appropriate marketing? How do we speak in the right language to make that happen? You know, for example, if you were to take some of what we've discussed in here, and we have a tendency to get pretty technical and use jargon and use language, proprietary language. And, you know, for example, we would say something like, don't eat ding-dongs because ding-dongs, you should avoid, you know, partially hydrogenated oils. If you do that, it'll help reduce the probability that you'll suffer cardiopulmonary impacts later in life. What we really should be saying is ding-dongs will make you fat and you may die. You know, so that's the difference that we've got. You know, that first message that we put out sounds like that. And we'll hit a few people, and that'll get us a little bit of the way, and we've made some pretty good progress on that thus far. We talk about the impacts of hurricanes, and we talk about all the scientific aspects of it, and that gets a certain point of we get that part of that message across. But we've got to start thinking more like our customers and start talking in the language that they understand so that message will penetrate. Now, I use the word customers on purpose because our customers are a wide variety of groups. I mean, our customers can be citizens, our customers can be elected officials, our customers can be the stakeholders who assist us in the Emergency Operations Center or wherever else it is that we're functioning as we prepare for and recover from hurricanes. Each one of those needs a different set of language, a different set of terminology, a different set of things that help trigger their motivating factors and gets them to act in the way that we want. We also need to do it in a way that in the communication media that meets them where they are. We have done a good job in the past, and we will continue to do so, about doing the full color inserts that go in the Sunday paper. And we've done a good job of doing the television specials that air at the beginning of hurricane season. And those will continue again to do a good job going forward. However, less and less people are going to see those every year. So we've got to make sure that we understand what are the other communications media that people are using these days, and what is the content that fits that most appropriately so that we can hit all of those folks. We can't abandon any of the things that we've used in the past. There maybe there's a few we can abandon. We don't need to fax people stuff anymore. But we gotta keep the old stuff and start putting the new stuff out there and do it in a way that matches the format. You know, we can't put out a 30-minute special on Vine. We can't tweet out the entire evacuation zone for the entire state of Florida, but match the content with the media so that it gets to the people we're trying to hit, and do it in a language that they understand. That's going to be different than how we talk to our local elected officials. You know, they're going to have a different set of motivating factors, but each one of us is going to at some point interface with local elected officials, and we're going to have to condense everything we know about this event into a very short brief to them and help them understand what it is we need them to say and we need to do in that situation. And we've got to understand best what is their motivating factor in that one. And it's going to vary depending on what level of government they operate and what their function is. The folks in the legislative side may be more concerned about monetary impact and how things are going to be funded. The folks on the executive branch side may be more concerned about the operational aspect of it. But understand who it is that you're talking to, understand what their motivating factors are, and help make sure that the content you are delivering to them is timely and accurate and meets their need, which is going to help you meet your need. You know, so when they stand up in front of the television and you're going to be standing at, over here, over their shoulder, that they're saying the things that you need them to say. But you've got to make sure that you focus that content. As much as we would like, and we will continue to do so, we will put out all kind of webinars and trainings and education and things like that, and we'll hit a certain number of those elected officials, but a good chunk of them will not do anything until the time actually comes to help us deliver that message. So be prepared for that. Make sure that you've got a way to get them that information, that vital information, as quickly and accurately and as timely as possible so that they can help get it out there. Same thing for your other stakeholders. Your other stakeholders will more than likely be more engaged in this ahead of time. But make sure that you, again, understand whatever perspective they're bringing to the table, and consider that as you communicate with them to help them understand how this ties into their overall mission, ties into their overall goals, and similarly motivates them to participate in this as well. So again, words are important in this. The medium is important. And every single year, every single day, every single month, every single week, we need to reconsider and make sure that we are actually meeting the customer's needs. We can't say the same thing year after year in the same way and expect that we're going to make improvement on this thing. We've got to keep, that core stuff that we already do and continue to push it out, because we cannot afford to only hit a small portion of the population. We got to make sure that message is getting out to everybody. The second piece of it, take advantages of change. Change is a great time to get people to start to think about what it is you're trying to say. If it's a nice blue sky, sunny day, probably not going to get too much penetration in talking about hurricanes. But if that weather changes significantly, and now it looks pretty bad, or the date changes and now it's June 1st and it's beginning of hurricane season, or we've just had a hurricane impact the state or somewhere else in the country, or another major disaster has happened. Those are changes. Those are points at which people are going to be more receptive to hearing that kind of messaging. So we've got to be able to jump on that change and take advantage of it. A couple of major changes I think coming out right now that we can utilize. One is the changes with the National Flood Insurance Program. As Craig mentioned earlier, 37% of the flood insurance policies in the United States are in Florida. That's 2.1 million policies in the state of Florida. So when you consider family size, roughly a third of Floridians have national flood insurance policies on their home in the state. A good chunk of those, roughly 20% of those policies, have previously been subsidized. And so as the Biggert Waters Act and the Grim Waters and those other things take effect over the next few years, they're going to see increases in their flood insurance premiums. And some of them are going to be fairly significant increases in their flood insurance premiums. That has caused and will continue to cause disruptions in the real estate market, disruptions in the insurance market, disruptions in communities, as people may no longer be able to afford to live in the homes that they have lived in the past, and will dissuade people from moving into those homes. So it's going to change Florida communities over time. I'm not exactly sure how yet, but it's starting to, and it's going to continue to change Florida communities. That has created an opportunity to address some of the things we can do to improve the program. One of the programs that is associated with the National Flood Insurance Program is the community rating system. It's that part of the flood insurance program that gives you credits for mitigation activities that you take in that community. You can achieve up to a 45% savings on flood insurance premiums through programs associated with a community rating system. That is a fantastic way to get mitigation conversations going in your communities. If you talk to your local elected officials, if you talk to your citizens and say, listen, if we do this, 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 and this, we can reduce your flood insurance premium almost by half. We've done a pretty good job of it in Florida to this point, but this is really the opportunity to do a whole lot more. Across the country, participation, though, is terrible. 6% of the flood insurance communities in the country participate in the community rating system, meaning that 94% of the communities across the country do not participate and pay that full rate for the flood insurance premium. Whereas if they just took a few simple things, they could reduce it by 5%, 10%, 15%, again, all the way up to 45%. Right now is the window of opportunity for that. You know, we've heard earlier in some previous conversations and sessions, there are folks who have not been motivated to do these kinds of things before. Realtors before weren't extremely excited about telling folks who were coming to buy a house that that neighborhood tends to flood or that that house has experienced a flood before. Now, however, realtors are extremely interested in being part of this program because they recognize that people know about flood insurance now. They know about floods. They're starting to look up the flood map and recognize that that property is flood prone, and that flood insurance rate has either already gone up or is going to significantly go up, and they're looking for solutions. One of the things in a community rating system you can do is have realtors have brochures and conversations with prospective buyers about the flooding aspect of a community and give them that information. And for that, the community can take credit and get discounts. So realtors are now eager participants in this entire process. Community leaders, whereas before chambers of commerce want to continue to grow that community, now recognize the public has that information. They know about flood insurance, so they want to do everything they can to reduce the impact of those rate increases. Community rating system is the way to do that. And in Florida now, we've hired some folks full-time to work on the community rating system to help communities better take advantage of this program and increase their standing in that program. Danny Henson, who's over here, runs that program for us for the State Division of Emergency Management. Our goal is to get every community in the state of Florida enrolled in the community rating system so that everybody is in that program and can start working towards achieving more discounts. The big impact of that, of course, is money, but the bigger picture is that these communities, by undertaking these mitigation actions, will now have a more resilient community. They're going to be better prepared for the next natural disaster and flood that hits there. They're going to be able to respond better. They're going to be able to recover more quickly, and they're going to become a more vibrant and economically viable community. So everybody benefits in this one. Even those folks who don't necessarily own a flood insurance policy in that community are going to be better off because the entire community will be better prepared for that next flood, and less resources are going to have to go to deal with it. And so it's, again, a tremendous opportunity. People are now paying attention to this. A couple of years ago, this opportunity did not exist. When flood insurance rates were fully subsidized, the rates were so low that, frankly, there wasn't that much motivation to get into this. But now that there's a dollar impact to it, people are paying attention, and this is the window of opportunity to get in there and start doing some more mitigation activities. The storm surge graphic that's going to be coming out from the National Hurricane Center, another good opportunity this year. That's another way to help us get storm surge in front of the public, because as we see these storms coming in, that's going to be something else that's pushed out. Media will cover that. Citizens will see that. That's another great opportunity for the meteorologists, for the TV media folks, for us as emergency managers and others to have that conversation with the public and say, hey, this is the storm surge graphic. This is potentially where that water could be. And by the way, that correlates with the evacuation zones. Here's the evacuation zones for that community. Here's what you need to know. So it's a great opportunity. It's going to be coming out. People are going to see it. Let's grab onto that and develop the communications plan so that we can start attaching the other things we need to that, most specifically, the evacuation zone. So again, great opportunity is going to happen this summer. We need to prepare for that, make sure we're ready to go to get that out in front of folks. Elections. Elections always drive change, and that's a really good opportunity, again, to start engaging those stakeholders. As you've got potentially folks who are paying really close attention to disasters in their communities, engage them at that point. If you've got newly elected officials in your community, go and talk to them about what it is that you do and how it is that they can become involved with that. So every election cycle, every 2 years, you're going to have a new crop of folks come in there. Grab that. Get out there and talk to them as soon as you can. Help them understand their role in emergency management. Let them know about the training and exercises and everything else that come along. They're going to be overwhelmed at some point with everything else they have to do. So the earlier you can get them in that process, the better off you're going to be. And then finally, other disasters. Utilize other disasters as an opportunity to have a conversation with your stakeholders about how that would impact your community. Talk about Typhoon Haiyan, or talk about the landslide in Oso, Washington, or talk about Hurricane Sandy, and bring that back as locally as you need to help understand how it would impact your community and what you all would be doing in that kind of situation. Disasters drive changes, drive advancements in what we all do. Everything we do is named after a previous disaster. The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, the PCIMRA, the Katrina Reform Act. Everything we do is named after some previous disaster. So latch on to those. Those are significant changes that drive major policy changes in how we operate. Use those also as talking points to help start people thinking about how that could impact them personally and impact them in their community. The third piece of it is driving consumer demand. And frankly, I've been thinking about what we've been talking about in the last couple of days with regards to building codes and how it is our built environment is prepared for hurricanes and other things. And I've been relating it to the automobile industry. You know, in automobiles over the last 50 and 100 years, we've made huge gains. You know, today we all drive vehicles that have airbags all over the place. They've got ABS, they've got traction assist, they've got lane change notification things, they've got blind spots. All the cars that are on the verge of driving themselves, parking themselves, being fully autonomous. We've got highways that are designed to travel at 80, 90, 100 miles an hour safely, and, you know, to eliminate any potential hazards from the road. When you compare, if you looked, however, at how we treat our houses across the country, while we're out, you know, in the roads, we're driving Teslas on superhighways on the Autobahn. Our homes are more the equivalent of chitty chitty bang bang on a dirt road. You know, we have not embraced all of the things that are available to us at very low cost and building those into our homes. We want to be as safe, apparently we want to be as safe as we can on the road, but at home we're willing to flip a coin or roll the dice. That's got to change. We've got to drive consumer demand to help change that. We've got to start people thinking about today. People would not dream of going and buying a car that did not have airbags or did not have seat belts or did not have blinkers, but they wouldn't dream of buying a used car without pulling the Carfax report and seeing what kind of incidents that car has been involved with in the past. But when you buy a home, again, you may or may not know whether that home is ever flooded. You may or may not know what kind of nails they use on there, what kind of shingles they use on there, whether they've got internal bracings, et cetera. So we've got to help generate that same level of interest from consumers on their homes as we do on their automobiles. And I think it's probably going to be a two-part piece on that. Some of those things will have to be regulatory. You know, we continue to work on improving building codes across the country, but we've got a long way to go on that piece of it. And certainly we need to have those kind of things for consumers that are not going to be able to either find on their own or going to be very hard to find afterwards. You know, length of nails, types of shingles, types of bracing, et cetera. Well, we also need to get consumers to start asking for and demanding those kinds of things from their builders. You know, right now, the conversation will be more like, what kind of laminate do you want on your kitchen counter, or what color entryway do you want to have there? That'd be like us going to the dealership and say, I don't care about airbags, how many cup holders can I get in this vehicle? You know, so we've got to help shift that and start people thinking about safety in their homes, because it can make a huge difference. And I think we can help drive that discussion by helping people understand what's in the realm of possibility when it comes to mitigating those kinds of damages. And I've heard other conversations this week about making it personal. Again, big opportunity for us right now. One of the reasons that we demand safety in our automobiles is because either we've been in an accident ourselves, or we know somebody who's been in a car accident. So we can visualize the fact that we could be in a car accident, and we want to be as safe as we can in that situation. Most of us, however, or many of us, however, don't know somebody whose house has been destroyed by a tornado or whose home has been swept away by a storm surge, and so we have a harder time personalizing that. However, the world is shrinking, the United States is shrinking. We keep track of all of our friends on Facebook. We know every disaster that happens as soon as it happens, and we're able to see through the media and other sources exactly how those people feel and what kind of things they've experienced. So we're able to more and more personalize that kind of disaster. We can bring that home to folks. We should take that and follow up immediately with, here's how you can prevent that from happening from you. And so as we're able to more and more make those disasters personal for people, that's when we start tying in that consumer demand about making that better protection for them in their own homes. And so that's the third piece of it. Let's figure out how to drive consumer demand for safer homes, for safer structure, for safer infrastructure, and make it personal for folks so they have a desire and a motivation to actually pursue those kinds of things. And then finally, collaborate. We got to collaborate better. We've got to do a better job of getting beyond our own little area of expertise and figuring out how we can do this thing writ large. You know, there's a few things that irritate me, and you hear people say all the time. After a disaster, there's a couple of things that I can almost guarantee somebody is going to say. One is, if it's bad enough, they're going to say, it looks like a war zone. Trust me, you'll see that every disaster. Somebody's going to say that. The other thing you'll hear people say is, I've lived here, and this is an example, I've lived here 7 years and I've never seen an EF5 tornado destroy the entire downtown before. You know, there's some expectation that they have seen everything bad that can happen in their community, when we all know that that simply is not the case, but it happens time and time again. The third thing that irritates me is something that we say. which is, that's nice, but it's not going to work here. Every one of us says that. I say it about the state of Florida. County directors say it about their counties compared to the next county. The United States says about other places. They say that's very nice, but it's probably not going to work here. The fact is, that's probably not right. You know, if that were the case, we would be drinking different flavor Coca-Cola in every single town in the United States of America. We'd go to McDonald's and you'd have to order a specific hamburger that was different from everywhere else in the United States. We'd be eating jambalaya flavored Doritos in Louisiana and Maine lobster roll Doritos in Massachusetts. That's not the case. Again, as we move towards a bit more homogenization across the United States of America because of the prevalence and the sharing of all the media that we have, as we move towards the fact that people can interface everywhere across the board, and we start giving people a little bit more credit for, we give people more credit than we currently give them, I think we can probably come up with some solutions that will allow us to have something across the board here. And that's going to be important because if we continue to try to tell people about evacuation zones, but this county says they're A through E, and this county says they're 1 through 5, and this county decides not to publish them, and this one calls them red, green, yellow, blue, orange, it's going to be very difficult to get out there and do the education that we have to do in any kind of systematic way. And so we've got to continue to push forward for solutions that will allow us to educate our folks beyond just that individual little municipal or county or state level. We've got to be able to leverage the larger media outlets and the larger communication channels so that we can get people into this kind of thing. We've got to be able to give a little bit on these topics so that we can achieve the outcome we're looking for. And so I think it's doable. I know that it won't be exactly right for every single person, but I think in the big picture, it's going to be much better for us. It will allow us to utilize the media markets more wisely. It will allow us to share the types of education and outreach products that we all have and really make sure that we're meeting that need and moving the ball forward on helping to create that atmosphere that will allow people to buy into what it is we're trying to tell them. Because the more difficult we make it for them, the more difficult we make it for them to understand that it's different from place to place and you got to go here for this information and there for that information and this one's here and that one's there, they're not going to do it. We've got to streamline it, we've got to make it easy, and we've got to, wherever we can, pursue common nomenclature and concepts so that people will latch on to it and really buy into what it is we're trying to talk about. So those are the 4 things I wanted to talk about today. And again, we're making good progress. We certainly are. Every single year we do better and better, and I'm pleased. And we will eventually get there. But I, like many of you, are impatient and want to get there faster. And so again, I think we can accelerate this process by doing some of the things we talked about today. Now, I actually got some tweets. I got some questions here. So let me kind of go through some of these and see which ones I can answer here. This one is from Liz Gunnifson. She says, any chance we can advocate for a simpler CRS application? Absolutely. Liz, I don't know where you are here, but that's what I'm working on. Danny is working on that with me as well. I had a chance last week or week before last to go to Washington, D.C. and testify before Congress about some of the stuff we're working on, and that's one of the messages to them. They've got to make this thing easier. It is administratively burdensome for smaller communities to try to get into the community rating system because you've got to spend a certain amount of time and effort just to get into the program. And the smaller the community, the less likely it is that you're going to have an employee who can devote that much time and energy to the CRS application. In Florida, we've got 47% of the communities into that program. The other 53 are going to be extremely hard because they only represent the smaller towns. And we've got to get to a point where they can do it without spending a lot of time and effort on it because that same person whose job is that has 7 other jobs within that jurisdiction as well. So we are trying to advocate all we can to make it a simpler application process. We're also trying to do everything we can at the state level so that you can take credit for all of those state points. So basically, my preference would be, if it takes 500 points to get into the CRS program, my preference would be that Florida has 500 points. All you have to do as a jurisdiction is say, hey, Florida's got 500 points that I'm taking credit for, I'm signing up for it, and we're in the program. We're also trying to get to the point where we can have Florida or another state certify your CRS application. Instead of having to go to the federal government for that approval, let us do it in the state. We know those folks. We can do all the work required within the state. We'll speed up that process tremendously, get them into the program. Once jurisdictions are in the program, they're much more going to want to pursue advancement in the program. So we are absolutely trying to make it an easier process to get into the CRS. Let me see here. This one is, what are some good ways for EMs to pinpoint stakeholders like realtors to help prepare disaster-resistant communities? That's another great question. That's from Jean-Claude Schaff. You got to go out and talk to them. You can't wait for them to come to you. They are just as busy as you are, so you got to go out and find those groups. My recommendation, go through the associations. In Tallahassee, we do that all the time. We go and find the Realtors Association. We go and find the Home Builders Association. Go and find those groups who you think you can motivate to participate in this. Figure out what their motivations will be, and then go and have that conversation. Get them engaged with it and let them talk to their members. It does take a little bit of legwork. Figure out what the right level is. Some things are going to be the right level. It's at that community level. Some of it might be at the state level. Some of it might be the federal level. But there's all of us are in some association or more. Figure out what partnerships we have there. But get out there and pursue it. Figure out, again, what the benefits are going to be to them, and take that to them and help them understand why they might want to be involved in that process. Again, it's a bit of a legwork, but the benefits that you will gain will certainly outweigh the work that you have to put into it. Here's a question from my buddy Justin Noakes. It says, what's the most effective way to communicate to our low-income population who may not have access to social media outlets? Justin, in Florida, we have both low-income and elderly population. I think that, as it may be even now, low-income population, I think, probably has more access to social media than we may realize at this point. And certainly as it gets cheaper and we become more accessible over time, that problem will get less and less. The elderly population, same thing. I think, in Florida, we're going to have to continue to rely upon those older mechanisms, those tried and true mechanisms to communicate with our elderly population. The TV specials, the newspapers, the community associations, the homeowner associations, the condo associations, the bridge clubs, the churches. Those are the ways, the tried and true mechanisms that we will continue to utilize going forward. We will not get rid of those. However, I think both elderly and our low-income population are going to have more and more access to an understanding of how the social media sites may work as well. And so over time, we may be able to shift some of our resources away from those towards those. Again, we've got to have a comprehensive solution, so we can't subtract anything at this point. We may, however, be able to change some of the focus percentage-wise over time as we understand how people are accessing and utilizing that information. And then finally, I got one more. Let me see here. It says, well, that's an ad, so forget that one. But again, thank you all for being here today. I love the Hurricane Conference, love the National Hurricane Conference. I'll put a plug in for the Governor's Hurricane Conference. If you enjoyed talking about hurricanes in Orlando, come back next month. We're going to do the exact same thing. Because these are fantastic conversations. I come away from these things with literally pages of notes and scores of business cards. And my staff doesn't always enjoy them because I come back and simply pass them out with to-dos. But we make tremendous progress. I love hearing from you all, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Max.
Thank you so much, Brian. A lot of good points to take away, take back home with us all. The next speaker is Dr. Chris Landsea. Chris is the Science and Operations Officer at the National Hurricane Center, who is responsible for the administration and evaluation of the Joint Hurricane Test Bed projects, which, if proven successful, will then be implemented into operations to make the monitoring and forecasting of hurricanes much better. Chris got his PhD from Colorado State University under Bill Gray. Before that, actually after that, he worked for the Hurricane Resource Division for about 10 years and had the honor of flying into about 15 hurricanes, I believe, including Katrina. I was fortunate enough to be able to hire him away from the Hurricane Resource Division while I was at the Hurricane Center. And when I would hire someone, I always looked for someone passionate about hurricanes. I knew that Chris is extremely passionate. All three of his children are named after major hurricanes. Chris.
Thanks, Max, and thank you everyone for sticking around this afternoon. I am reminded of a story when Max called me after I applied for one of the hurricane specialist jobs at the National Hurricane Center in 2005. Miles Lawrence, who I think is in the audience, retired, and Rick Knabb and I were finalists for this position. and I was very confident I was going to get it. Max called me, and with his Oklahoma twang, said, "Sorry, Chris, Rick's got the job, but I'd really like you to apply for the Science and Operations Officer job." And of course, I told Max, "I don't want that darn job, goodbye." Fortunately, I came to my senses a couple days later and did put an application in and worked for Max for a couple years. So what I want to talk to you about today is hurricane history and what we can learn from hurricanes of the past so we can better prepare for the ones in the future and the ones that are coming this year and next year and the ones thereafter. So to start off, I think it's important that we look at, so I can click here. There we go. Let's go back, please. There we go. Okay. So the day is August 27th in 2005, and Hurricane Katrina is in the Gulf of Mexico. David and Kimberly King of Waveland, Mississippi are getting their home prepared for the arrival of Hurricane Katrina. You can actually see that their shutters are getting ready to be deployed on their windows. They were told they were in an evacuation zone. They did the right thing, and they evacuated. It took them a month to get back because of all the destruction that had occurred in the Mississippi area. And when they came back, this is all they had left. They had about a 20-foot storm surge that had come through. I'll go back so you can see that again there. And carried essentially everything away. For those who had a chance to see the impact of Katrina, is just enormous, the power that hurricanes have. So they did the right thing. But unfortunately, 200 people, some of them their neighbors in Mississippi, stayed and drowned. And another 1,300 in and around New Orleans stayed and drowned. And this is from a hurricane that every single person knew was coming and was going to hit. Perhaps some of them didn't know, like what Rick Knabb had suggested earlier today, you need to know if you're in a hurricane evacuation zone. And that's something people can find out today by contacting the local emergency managers. So what we want to do is try to understand how have hurricanes changed in the past, what is our vulnerability to hurricanes, and how can we better prepare for them in the future. Let me go a little bit more. Hurricane fatalities in the U.S. are primarily due to water. Even though it's wind that gets the biggest attention, half of the deaths in the last 50 years have been due to storm surge, where the ocean is shoved ashore by the strong winds. Another 1/4 are due to the freshwater flooding, due to rainfall and then flash floods and mudslides. Another 10% are due to surf or ships right offshore. So full 85% of all the fatalities in the U.S. are due to water when a hurricane or tropical storm comes ashore. So that's why the big focus has been lately on preparing for this water hazard, especially the storm surge. Now, I think it's important to understand what we're talking about when we discuss societal vulnerability or risk to hurricanes. It's a combination of two factors. It's the exposure that we have as people, and it's also the incidence. So exposure, what that means is three things. It's property at risk, it's the people that live there, the population that's at risk, and it's also how much preparedness, how much understanding does the population have about hurricanes and what to do. Combine that with incidence, that is how often do you get hurricanes to hit and how strong can they be. It's very different intensity-wise from Eastport, Maine down to Key West, Florida, of what kind of hurricane can strike. So if you have an area that gets hit a lot but has no people, so high incidence but low exposure like the Florida Everglades, you don't have a vulnerability issue. And then conversely, if you have a lot of people living but you don't get hurricanes to hit, say in Chicago, you don't have a hurricane issue either. So it's the combination of where you have a large number of people living in harm's way where hurricanes do come ashore. So it's important to point out that when you look at where strong hurricanes have hit, category 3s, 4s, and 5s, going back the last century or so, that the entire U.S. coast, from Texas to Florida to the Carolinas to New England, has been hit by major hurricanes. It's worth pointing out that the worst case ones does vary along the coast. The Category 5s have occurred in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida, but it is possible for a Category 5 all the way up to the Carolinas. You can see the farthest north one, that's Hurricane Hazel in 1954, occurred at the South Carolina-North Carolina border, with Category 3s further north. It is possible for a borderline Category 4 to affect the Mid-Atlantic or the New England states, but not a Category 5. So it's important to know what could occur as kind of worst case scenarios. Well, then the combination of vulnerability, that is, again, exposure and incidence, has caused multiple fatalities anywhere along the U.S. coast. You can see from Texas to Louisiana to Florida to the Carolinas to New England, these are the hurricanes and tropical storms that have killed at least 25 people. So every stretch of our coast is vulnerable because of the combination of having hurricane strikes and people living there. The same is not true for property at risk. You can see that these strikes, these are the most costly hurricanes on record, tend to be where the major metropolitan areas are. So Houston area, New Orleans area, South Florida, and New England tend to have the most costly hurricanes and the potential for costly hurricanes. We'll never have a $20 billion hurricane for coastal Georgia, for example, because the property at risk is much less. So let's go through a few specific examples of this vulnerability to hurricanes, the combination of exposure, number of people, and incidents. And so the first example is for Florida, and this shows the population for Florida going from 1900 all the way up to 2010. You can see the last census report showed we had about 19 million people living in coastal counties, actually all of Florida. 1950 was where the first year that we started getting air conditioners in homes. Hard to imagine living in Florida today, year-round, without air conditioner. So that's why the jump occurred in 1950. You go back to 1900, you can see that, well, it looks like about 11 people lived in Florida in 1900. All right. It was a few more, but not many. Actually, there's only about 40,000 people that lived in all of South Florida back in 1900. So it's a very different coastline that a hurricane hits today. So the exposure, that is the number of people, have gone way up over the last few decades. How has the incidence occurred? Well, this shows number of major hurricanes that have hit by decade. And I'll go back and forth. You can see early part of the 20th century, there's regularly 2 major hurricanes that hit Florida each decade, with a peak in the 1940s of 5 major hurricanes making landfall. And in that same period of time where the population started going way up in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, didn't have many strong hurricanes. There was a bit of a lull. At the same time, everybody started moving to Florida. And then, of course, the decade of the 2000s, we saw a resumption of the strong hurricane strikes in the years 2004 and 2005. Not unprecedented, but just like what we saw back in the 1940s. Of particular concern to me and many, many people is what could happen in Tampa Bay. Extremely low-lying, funnel-shaped bay if a hurricane hits just north of it near Tarpon Springs. And if the 1921 hurricane were to hit today, it was low-end Category 3, be producing storm surge around 12 feet at maximum, and hundreds of thousands of homes would be flooded, and the potential for many, many people to lose their lives. People in Tampa don't think they have hurricanes, all right? Just like what Mr. Brian Koon was saying earlier, it's not happened to me, it hasn't happened to my parents, it never happens. Well, you just have to go back far enough in time and you'll see that indeed Tampa has had very strong hurricanes previously. So that's example number 1. Number 2 is Georgia. Coastal Georgia, you can see the population has gone up very dramatically as well in the last few years. And if you look at the hurricane history for Georgia, since 1900, they've had no major hurricanes, and they've had only 2 Category 2s, the last being Hurricane David in 1979. So again, you live in Georgia, Savannah or Brunswick, you have never experienced a major hurricane. Your parents have never experienced a major hurricane, and even your grandparents had not experienced a major hurricane. Perhaps they're invulnerable. They don't. Well, again, fortunately, we've got good hurricane records going way back in time. And if you go back further to 1850, there were actually 3 major hurricanes that struck the Georgia coastline: 1854, 1896, and 1898. The 1898 in particular was just like Hugo. Category 4, very large storm, barreled in from the southeast and killed thousands of people. So these storms in the 1890s are some of the deadliest time in U.S. history. One concern I have is that today, the number of people that stay behind, that should be evacuating, is more that lived there 100 years ago. Okay, so that means there's a big potential for people to lose their lives, even with a 90% evacuation rate. So the reason why it's very vulnerable there is because it's so low-lying. It's beautiful places to live and visit, but it's extremely vulnerable to storm surge, where you can get a huge storm surge in that area when you get a strong hurricane or even a Category 1 or 2 hurricane. Remember, we're focusing on the impacts, not the category. Third example is for New England. And New England has been very fortunate in the last few years. Indeed, if we look at the hurricane strikes, this would be all hurricanes, New England, going from Connecticut eastward, has not had a direct hit by a hurricane since Bob in 1991. And if you look at the strong hurricane strikes, you've got to go back even further. The last major hurricanes that hit the area were Edna in 1954 and Carol in 1954. So it's a rare event. Only 4 major hurricanes in 160 years. So again, you haven't experienced it. Your parents haven't. Maybe even your grandparents haven't experienced it. But it can happen. And a big concern is that the vulnerability, again with storm surge, is such that with a strong hurricane making landfall, you can drive storm surge up to 15 or even 20 feet in some parts of New England. The worst case hurricanes, as I mentioned, the 1938 Great New England Hurricane, shown on the right, the track it took. But there's even a stronger hurricane if our historical records are in the right ballpark. In 1635, the colonial people experienced a tremendous hurricane that was as strong or even stronger than the 1938 Great New England Hurricane. They don't happen very often, but they will happen again. And we need to make sure everyone is prepared for the eventual return of a strong hurricane in New England. So a little bit about how is the vulnerability changing when it comes to hurricanes themselves. We know that the vulnerability is increasing because of exposure, more people living in harm's way. What about the hurricanes themselves? This picture from 2005 shows the huge amount of activity that occurred. That wasn't a single day, by the way. It's a composite. For those of us dealing with hurricanes in 2005, that's what it felt like every day, but that was the whole season. But we had 4 major hurricanes making landfall. And there was a lot of discussion back then, well, is global warming causing these hurricanes to be more numerous or stronger? And those questions still are ongoing today. So it's important to take a look at the historical records. We want to know, is the vulnerability getting worse? Because hurricanes are getting worse. That's an important question. When we do that, we look at the number of major hurricanes going back to World War II, because that's when we started flying into hurricanes on purpose to see what's going on in the middle of them. We can see that there's 2 periods that have been very busy, the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and then a big lull from around 1970 until 1994. And in 1995 onward, generally, it's been quite busy. But the busyness we've seen the last 2 decades mirrors what we saw in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And other records suggest that it might have even been busier in the late part of the 19th century. So what we see are swings of hurricane activity and no indication of any trends that may be due to global warming. What we see instead is these swings of hurricane activity are tied to changes in the Atlantic Ocean, where you get a warm ocean, you get less wind shear to tear apart the storms, and more thunderstorms to help the hurricane grow. In these cold periods of this Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, you get the opposite. More wind shear and a more stable atmosphere, more difficult for thunderstorms to grow. So this is a natural oscillation that has a big control over hurricanes. That's what's shown on the bottom. What's on top are the sea surface temperatures, and they have been going up. And I have no problem ascribing that to man-made global warming. But to me, that's more the tail. The big dog in what's going on, the majority of the changes by far, this is natural oscillation that we've been seeing, that oceanographers have told us have been going on for a millennium. So one question that's come up after the 2013 season is, well, it was really quiet. It wasn't expected. Are we seeing the end of this active period? And I think it's just too early to say at this point. Yes, it was quiet, only 2 hurricanes, both of them quite weak. But when you look at the ocean temperature structure, we're still seeing warmer than normal water in the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico. And that's consistent with one of these active periods that's going on thus far. So my expectation is we'll continue to be in this enhanced period, at least for the short term. So what about global warming itself? What kind of expectations are there for changes due to global warming? After Hurricane Sandy, there was immediate outcry that Sandy was due to global warming. You can see the Statue of Liberty being inundated by the strong waves, the gigantic signature of Hurricane Sandy, Business Week proclaiming it's global warming stupid, and protests showing end climate science. Important questions, but perhaps they didn't have quite all the science, because if you look on the bottom left where it has the hurricane symbol, it's spinning the wrong way. So if they have that part of the science wrong, maybe other aspects are in question. So I don't have an opportunity to go into a detail here, but if we look at how global warming may be affecting things, there are legitimate questions. How are the numbers of hurricanes? How are the intensity? How strong? Where will they form? Where will they track in the overall activity? So it's all very legitimate, important questions. And when you go into the answers, it's actually it's kind of mixed. Hurricanes are a heat engine, so intuitively you would expect, well, if it's warmer waters, more moist, perhaps we'll have stronger, more numerous hurricanes. And indeed, if somebody asked me, are we likely to see stronger hurricanes because of global warming, I say yes. But I say that's really not the best question. The better question is how much? Are we looking at some small change now and in the future, or something gigantic? Because that's a very important distinction. And when you do that, and you look at the studies that have been published, what has been shown is that it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to what may happen because of global warming and hurricanes. So I kind of color-coded it here. Green means good, and red kind of means bad. The numbers of storms and hurricanes looks like it'll moderately decrease. We may actually have 1/4 fewer hurricanes because of global warming. The wind speed may increase as expected, but a fairly tiny amount, maybe only about 3%. So something that would have been a 100-mile-per-hour hurricane previously would be a 103-mile-per-hour hurricane at the end of this century. To me, that sounds like that's kind of that much. Not much. Same thing with storm surge. The storm surge would increase the same amount proportionally to the winds, but if you have sea level rise on top of that, that would make any individual storm surge worse, even if the hurricane doesn't change. So if you have a 1-foot storm surge, for example, with Katrina, by the end of the century, an increase of sea level by 1 foot, Katrina's worst case would be 29 feet rather than the 28 feet that occurred. Rainfall may increase for storms, but on a fairly modest amount, roughly 10% or so in the core of the hurricane. And some potentially good news is the storms may actually form further away from the United States, closer to Africa, and they may tend to recurve slightly more often. So when one talks about hurricanes and global warming, it, to me, shouldn't be a poster child of how effects of global warming may be affecting our climate. It's really a mixed bag, and in general, fairly small changes are anticipated because of global warming and hurricanes. And with regards to Sandy itself, there's a paper published fairly recently that actually, I'm not going to read through the whole details on it, but they were looking at, are Hurricane Sandy-like storms more likely to occur in the future? And this is work published by Adam Sobel at Columbia University. He actually concluded that the opposite. It's less likely for Hurricane Sandy-like storms to occur in the future because of changes in the atmospheric circulation. So the kind of jumping to conclusions, I think, is somewhat not warranted when it comes to hurricanes and global warming. So I'm going to conclude by kind of going back to my title. I don't know if someone was wondering, maybe not, why I said sometimes the strong wind blows. That's actually right out of a junior high mural that was done after 1992's Hurricane Andrew, as these junior high kids that were trying to reconcile having their homes destroyed and coming to grips with it. And it's a beautiful mural that's actually displayed at the Florida International University Art Museum now. And the point is, the recognition is this stuff happens. Strong hurricanes hit in the past, and they will hit again in the future. And that's a recognition we need to deal with now, not any nebulous global warming years or decades in the future, but we have a massive vulnerability issue now because of the combination of exposure and incidents. A lot of people where hurricanes hit. So what are we doing about it? And we've heard a fair amount this week about some of the new products that are being debuted. And the storm surge inundation graphic, which I'm sure will be very useful to many in the emergency management community, in the media, and the public, is one way to convey spatially and graphically, very easily understandable, who is at risk for this particular hurricane. This is being developed by Jamie Rome and the Storm Surge Unit. Fortunately, he's hired a bunch of very big-brained people to help make this happen, and I'm sure you'll be excited to see it this hurricane season. And of course, in 2015, we're hoping to debut the storm surge warning to let folks know explicitly where there's life-threatening storm surge could be. So it's hopeful with this new information that people can make the right decisions more readily, and that you all in the emergency management community and the media community can better effectively convey those dangerous conditions. So to wrap up, going back to this plot that again I think shows nicely the combination of exposure, more people, and incidents or occurrences of hurricanes, where you can see the ramping up of population. More and more people are moving to Florida every day, but the same is true in Texas, and North Carolina, and New England, and our neighbors in the Caribbean. There's a lot more vulnerability because of our exposure, more people living in harm's way. And us at the National Hurricane Center, sometimes we get all excited with graphs and numbers and figures and calculations. We have to keep in mind what that really means when we're looking at this graph. And those red pixels, each of those red pixels is actually representing a person or a family. And it's our job, it's your job, to help those families prepare when the next hurricane hits, because we know it's going to hit, whether it's in 2014 or 15. Some of these families need a lot of help because they're pretty clueless, especially this family. I mean, that guy at the top has no clue what to do when a hurricane comes. But it's him and his parents and his family that need assistance and help from the government and the private sector to make the right decisions when a hurricane hits. Please don't tell my wife I showed this picture. So thank you all, and I appreciate it. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take one or two. Thank you.
Sure. Are there any questions for Dr. Landsea? Yes, sir.
Baby's name.
Well, that was our littlest hurricane named Frederick, but we have a 8-year-old whose name is Elena, 1985, and we have a Hurricane Mitch from 1995.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Oh, one more? Okay.
Observation
Well, the climate or the weather changes on all time scales, and it's been doing it since before people were around. And it's impossible to try to ascribe any particular event to either, to global warming itself, including what happened this winter. There's a huge amount of variability. Winter weather is kind of outside my area of expertise, but from what I know about hurricanes, we have swings of hurricane activity, and there's no indication that we're seeing stronger or more numerous hurricanes that you can tie to it. And that matches the expectations from all the published studies that are looking at the sensitivity of storm numbers and how strong they get to global warming.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our last speaker of the day is Dr. Lori Metters, the director of the Florida Catastrophic Storm Risk Management Center and research professor in risk management and insurance, College of Business at Florida State University. Dr. Metters was recently appointed the chair of the Florida Commission on Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology, a commission on which he's served as a statistics expert member since 2009. Currently, Dr. Metters is especially involved in catastrophic modeling, planning, and finance research. And today she's going to talk about an extremely important topic, flood insurance issues. Dr. Metters.
Yeah, I think this is a million-dollar question. Really, flood, what will it take to make it privately insurable? And I'm going to go ahead, don't want everybody to leave the room at once, but I'll go ahead and tell you I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I think I can ask decent questions that would help us arrive at a more specific answer than where we are today. And so hopefully some of what I share with you today will be helpful to you in thinking about the issue. The title on the slide is wrong. It should actually say flood. What will it take to make it privately insurable? And what I want to talk to you about sort of in brief is to give you a sense of where the NFIP is today and why it exists, because that does, I think, help get us toward thinking about the answer to the question. And then I'll get more specifically to private insurance issues. So very quickly, the NFIP makes federally backed flood insurance available to people. Why is that? Well, I mean, private insurers are in the business. There are private insurers that sell excess flood insurance above the amount that is the NFIP limit. So if private insurers are willing to sell the excess flood insurance, then why weren't private insurers more in the game to begin with? There's clearly supply there, if you will, for people who are interested in flood insurance. Well, the interesting thing about excess flood insurance is most of the people who are buying that can afford to pay the premium. That's a very big issue. So they can afford to pay the premium and they're willing to pay that premium, a market premium for flood insurance. And I think that that's a big issue that's going to become an affordability question about whether we can privately insure flood insurance on a widespread basis. The NFIP and its rate setting, if you will, in large part is determined by the FEMA maps. And without getting into all the technical detail, and I'm sure that some of the other folks have touched on this, although there's rate setting that depends on those maps, in fact, a lot of flood insurance that is sold today is heavily subsidized. So regardless of where you are on the map, for some people, the premium is heavily subsidized, and for others, it's not. And there is an argument that, well, even the subsidized folks, they're still paying more than people who aren't subsidized, because people who are subsidized tend to be in the higher risk areas. And while that is true, the subsidies are not making it easier to move to a private market. So I think it's also important to note. So we have the issue of, okay, there's already private excess flood insurance being sold out there and people are buying it. It's not a huge market, but people are buying it. But that's because they're willing to pay high premiums for it. or they have a lower risk property and the premium's not that high and they'd rather have the peace of mind. Then we have the other issue of there are some in the flood program who are being subsidized in their rates and others who are not, and that sort of subsidy makes it more difficult to privatize. It makes it very difficult for the private market to pick up from the ground up, if you will, and say, okay, we can make hay with this, we can make a market with this. So we've got to move to full risk rates in order to be able to get to a market environment where private insurers see an opportunity for themselves. So when we look at the NFIP insurance program and how much insured value is in it, you know, to some of you it may look quite high. To me, it really doesn't. There are a lot of people not insuring their properties. This is not a tremendously large program in terms of the total number of properties that could be insured, and yet, because of the values here and because of the losses that have been experienced, this is still a major loss area for federal agencies. So this is a huge cost agency for the federal government, despite the fact that we're probably only 20% insured, or a little bit less than 20% insured for flood in the country. So the general financial condition of the NFIP I don't think comes as a surprise to people in this room. The program's in debt to the tune of somewhere between 26 and 30 billion dollars. A lot of that happening after Superstorm Sandy. A lot of it building up to that happening from Hurricane Katrina. So most of this debt has been since 2005. The concern is not that there is debt. The concern is that it's being borrowed from the U.S. Treasury, and that the NFIP program in the near future really has no clear-cut path to paying off that debt. So if we have yet again another storm, there's not a clear-cut path to how we get back to zero. And then just very quickly, again, not because this room needs to know it, but just kind of building up to what I want to say, then we have the Biggert Waters Act that came into play in 2012, and now followed by the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014, which effectively kind of pulls back on a lot of what Biggert Waters did, or at least temporarily pulls it back. So right now we're in this sort of big gray area, we're in this murky area where we're not sure what's going to happen with the flood insurance program. And the Government Accounting Office of the federal government released a report in January saying that, you know, we were mandated by Biggert Waters to look at strategies for privatizing this program. They released a full report to talk about how that could be done. And by the way, as a risk management professor looking at this hopefully objectively, I would say that generally speaking, I think what the Government Accounting Office came up with are some good ideas. The issue will be the implementation of those ideas. Are they implementable? And that's really where I want to spend the rest of today, is talking with you about whether some of the ideas that have been bantered about for how to handle flood insurance, how to privatize it, how to at least get the NFIP to full rates, is if these ideas are feasible, that we can feasibly attain them. Well, we start from why the NFIP is a public program in the first place. Why is it not already a private program? Why is it not part of the homeowner's insurance policy as opposed to being a standalone program that the federal government backs? The biggest reason is that long before insurers became so predominant in helping people handle the risk of their home and property, long before that, insurers already saw flood as a very scary place to go. Insurers have never embraced flood as a peril that created a great market for them. And the reason is plain and simple, which is floods are very common across the country in a lot bigger pockets and a lot more quantity of pockets than I think the general public realizes. And they can be incredibly destructive. And insurance companies see that. They do the math on that and think even paying for those randomly gets very dangerous for us. So an insurance company is looking at opportunities to, over the long run on average, make money, and frankly, they didn't see flood as a risk or a peril where that was going to be likely. So they're not excited about selling private flood insurance as part of their homeowners insurance policy ever. They were never excited about it. So they've long excluded flood insurance from the homeowners policy, and the NFIP was then, by 1968, for a host of reasons, but in part because there wasn't private insurance for flood, the NFIP was created because disaster relief was being paid out hand over fist to people to help repair after flood, and there was no other backstop for that. So as a reaction to several disasters that had really cost the federal government and taxpayers a lot of money, the federal government created this program. And again, there were other reasons as well, but strictly from a risk management standpoint, I think that was the main reason that the program was created. Now, it also did foster economic growth, real estate growth, and so it had some good impacts in that respect, and I'm sure that that did play into it. But from a risk finance standpoint, being able to cut down on disaster relief payouts was a big issue. Total insured values for homeowners insurance, so this is not the flood program, and by the way, there's a typo on here. This is not in trillions, this is in billions. These dollars amount to trillions, but they're not denoted in trillions here. So we don't have, for instance, in Alabama, 917.8 trillion. It's 917.8 billion, which is almost a trillion. So you see that for homeowners insurance, we're much more heavily insured in total insured value than we are for flood. Okay, in most states, people are fairly heavily insured for homeowners coverage, which excludes flood, and many of them because their mortgage company requires it. But even for people for whom the mortgage company doesn't require it, in most states, it's very affordable to be insured for the things that a homeowner's policy covers. There are states where that's not quite as true, like Florida, where I live and work. It's a much more expensive prospect there, although arguably not as expensive as it should be. New York, it's not an inexpensive prospect either, but in many states, relatively affordable, even at these total insured values. Flood insurance was created in '68, again, with several benefits, but it was created in part as any other social insurance program would be, or any other public program would be, which is to achieve a social good. And arguably a social good for this program was economic growth, which I think we can argue if you just look at one state, if you just look at Florida, clearly the flood program helped promote economic growth in the state of Florida. And as Chris Landsea was just saying, air conditioning helped too. But during that same period of time, we were seeing a flood program come into the picture and made it much more affordable for real estate developers to build in areas that had been unbuildable prior to the NFIP. The problem is that there's an unintended consequence of that, or an unintended, at least, result. That in fact, not only have we achieved economic development, and I certainly see this anecdotally myself in Florida, not only have we achieved economic development, but we've achieved it so well, we've been so successful that now we're paying out much more to wealthy people in the flood program than we are to the poorest people. So the wealthiest counties are receiving more of the claim benefits as well as filing more of the claims than we see in poor counties of this country. And a lot of that is it's just an unintended result of something good that happened, which was we promoted fantastic economic growth along the coast and near waterways. In addition to that, I was talking about the disaster relief savings benefit from the flood insurance program. And so there was a stated intention, not just an implied intention, but a stated intention when the NFIP was created that we wanted to relieve the taxpayers of so much disaster relief payout. And there have been, I'm only mentioning one study here, I will tell you over the last 30 years, there have been numerous studies, some of them theoretical, some of them laboratory experiments, but the latest one being very specific about the flood program, the flood insurance program, and very specifically an empirical study of actual insurance purchases that says frankly, for every 1% increase in average disaster aid grants, we're seeing a decrease by $6. Excuse me, that's $1 increase, not a 1% increase. For every $1 increase in the average aid, we're seeing a $6 increase in the amount of flood coverage purchased. Now, I will say we're not seeing necessarily a change in the number of policies. So if you read their research more carefully, and I want to be full information about that, it's not necessarily that we see that as aid increases that people are less likely to buy flood insurance, but for whatever reason they are buying less of what they're buying, so less flood coverage. And there's a direct correlation there. If anyone needs the citation for that paper, I don't think it's published yet in a journal, but it is available through the Wharton Risk Center. That may not sound like a big deal until you see how many federal disasters have been declared over a long period of time. So over the last 60 years or so, we've had thousands of federal major disaster declarations. So when you think about every time this happens and people have an expectation, and we believe it's the expectation that creates the change in attitude about the insurance purchase. Every time we have a major disaster declaration and people have an expectation that, oh, the people who experienced that are probably going to get a lot of money from the government. And so they think, well, I'm not in as bad a floodplain as some people I know, and there's all this, in truth, we know the government will take care of us. They'll bail us out if something really bad happens. I'm going to see how long I can go without buying this flood insurance. Maybe I'm even required to have it. Maybe I had it at one time, and I've kind of let it lapse, and no one has enforced that I repurchase it yet, so I'm just going to let it lay and see how long I cannot buy that, because, of course, the federal government would or should bail me out like they do these other folks if there is a disaster that causes flood on my property. So it's not a small problem because there are a lot of those disaster declarations made. Now, on the next slide, I'm not trying to draw any sort of an inference that these states have a particularly bad problem with their flood insurance program, so let me make that clear. But I do want to point out where we're seeing a lot of these disaster declarations being made. And in many cases, if you look at the highest risk states, highest risk in terms of numbers of major disaster declarations, over this many years, over 60 or so years, a lot of these are hurricane-prone states. This is why I included this slide. So then that brings us to the real meat, in my view, of today, which is, then what's it going to take if we've got a program? We know the insurers didn't really want a big piece of this business before the NFIP existed. Now the NFIP has had, 40 years or so to play around with it and see what they can figure out to do with it. They're having a tough time with it, just like private insurers thought they would if they had taken a big piece of that risk. So it's had an outcome that private insurers would have predicted. And we're looking at it thinking, well, okay, after the fact, after we've had this program and private insurers can see what the results have been for the federal government that tried to insure it, what will it take for them to want a big piece of it now? And so I'm going to walk you through sort of an Insurance 101. So if you've already taken Insurance 101, you can ignore this. But if you haven't, this is pretty basic stuff, but these are the elements that it takes for an insurance company or an insurance industry to ideally want to look at a risk and say, hey, that could be interesting to us. That's an area where we could help lower risk, reduce risk for other people, and make money at the same time. All of these are critical. So it's not that you've got to meet 3 out of 6 or 4 or 5, but literally an insurance company would want to be able to meet 6 out of 6 of these requirements in order to be interested in the coverage. The first is a large number of similar exposure units. And for those of you who took stats at any level, you've probably heard of the law of large numbers, and that's all they're saying. The insurance company wants to be able to make use of the law of large numbers, which is to say they just need to feel comfortable that they have enough stuff that they're insuring that's similar to each other, that they can set a price that they can count on as being a good price over the long run on average. They don't even need it to be a great price every year in the short term. They just need, within some reasonable period of time, for it to have been a good number so that tough years can be softened a bit by years where they didn't have losses and made good money, and maybe someone's property who experienced a big loss is softened for the insurance company by a lot of people not having losses at all. So an insurance company needs to be able to count on using the law of large numbers, otherwise the whole thing falls apart. There's no purpose for an insurance company to be involved. In other words, there's no advantage that an insurance company really has over the person who individually faces the risk, other than the fact that they hold a lot more capital than that individual person might. That's the only advantage at that point if they cannot use the law of large numbers. And so we'd say, well, does flood meet this criterion? Yes, I would say it does, because we have tons of people exposed to similar risk. So that's good news. So we do meet this criteria in general across a whole host of flood probable areas. Next question is, are flood losses subject to fortuitous losses only? Okay, and I'll put out a disclaimer immediately and say, in truth, is anything we insure subject to fortuitous loss only? No, because if nothing else, we have a big fraud problem out there. We have it in auto, we have it in homeowners insurance, we have it in workers' comp. We know we have a fraud problem. So obviously insurers are insuring perils that are subject to some non-fortuitous loss, some intentional loss in cases, or at least some non-accidental losses. But in general, insurance companies are looking for perils that they can insure where fortuitous loss would be what you expect, and then when there's a non-fortuitous loss, you eliminate it. But if you're concerned that an overwhelming amount of your loss could be non-fortuitous, not necessarily intentional, but something that systematically happens, that's repetitive, that could be predicted that it's going to happen again and again, then that's not ideal and not something that they want to insure. It's also important in talking about this, it is monumentally important to insurance companies that there be randomness in the losses. And so I would challenge us to think about flood and think about whether losses from flood are random. I mean, maybe the rain in a sense or the surge to an extent is random, but where floods happen and where they don't happen certainly is not random. And so the insurance industry would need a way within this non-randomness, if you will, to keep drilling down deeper and deeper and separating pockets of this risk until they have small groups where within that small group, at a fair price, whatever happens is random. So Joe, who's in this high-risk group, doesn't have a loss. Sally does have a loss, and it was random as to which one had the loss and which one didn't. But we know that non-randomly, they're both high risk. So an insurance company at least needs to be able to break it down to that level, where they know if there's some non-randomness in it, that they can separate groups until they get it down to, we know that loss happens to one person and not to another in this specific group, high risk, low risk, medium risk, what have you, on a random basis. Otherwise, frankly, without getting into the technical detail, the math just doesn't work, and the insurance company doesn't make money. So if they don't have that randomness available to them, they cannot make money. The next is not subject to catastrophic loss. And right on the face of it, I'm going to tell you, we just can't meet that with flood. And when I say catastrophic loss, I mean catastrophic to more than one insurer. I'm not just saying, oh, this could really be hard on one insurer. Flood can be hard on several insurers at one time. So it'll be difficult to create, I think, a private insurance system where you can guarantee that a number of insurance companies won't be incredibly adversely affected by one flood. They, at this point, would still be concerned that they could be. when they are concerned about that they can't diversify or push away their risk of catastrophic loss, they're obviously not going to be that interested in the risk. That's where being able to diversify across states, across types of risk, so they're covering more than just flood, for instance, and being able to purchase reinsurance at rates that they can afford. So just like consumers worry about being able to afford their insurance, the insurance companies worry about being able to afford their reinsurance. And to the extent that insurers can purchase reinsurance that protects them against the catastrophic risk, then this criterion becomes less important than it would otherwise be. But the issue of whether they can afford the reinsurance is a big issue and creates big questions. That losses would be determinable and measurable. This simply means, can you prove you had a loss? Well, flood, yeah. I mean, you go and look at a property and you can tell, okay, that's a flooded property, no doubt about it. The issues come in when they can't tell what caused the loss. There's a flood, there's wind, which happened first, which actually caused it. And I will say, in some ways, if the flood insurance program were privatized, it would certainly make it easier because we wouldn't be so concerned if insurance companies sold those products together. If they sold wind insurance and flood insurance together, we wouldn't spend so much time trying to figure out which came first, the wind or the water, because they'd both be insured, and so to some extent the insurance company wouldn't care. Now that they want to get their models right and be able to predict well in the future based on what happened there, they still care from a mitigation, loss reduction standpoint and from a modeling standpoint, but from a payout standpoint, it wouldn't be as big a deal. So there would be an advantage in that sense. But in another sense, I think they're very reticent to look at flood and feel like they can model it well enough, which brings us to the next slide, to feel like they can model it well enough to feel like it is determinable and measurable to the extent they would like. The next element of a real insurable risk is for losses to be calculable. And that may sound simple, but with flood it is not. In storm surge in particular, it is not. It's still a tough area for insurance companies to get their minds around. It's been a tough area for modelers, for risk modelers to get their minds around and feel confident with the numbers that they're producing, with the estimates that they produce of what the frequency would be, as well as what the cost, the expected loss cost would be that come from flood. And if you can't come up with those numbers, then you're going to have a lot of difficulty coming up with the right premium to charge. And I tell this to every first class I ever teach. I learned this as a 19-year-old, I think, at the University of Alabama, my first insurance class. The guy said, the only thing you need to remember from this entire semester is that insurance is the only product sold where the person selling the product does not know the cost of goods sold when they set the price. And so everything you've ever learned about insurance companies being bad and mean and greedy and all of this might be true, but you need to see it from their perspective for a minute. They're the only companies that set prices before they know what their costs are going to be. And so they can't build in definitive cost into their pricing structure. They become information hounds. They want to know everything they can because the more they know, the more they can calculate what their losses, which are what their costs will be primarily. That does sort of define most of their cost. If they can calculate their losses, they're getting a much better idea of what their cost of goods sold will be, even though they can't know it with certainty. And so this actually is a much more hinging criterion than you might think just on the surface. The other element of an insurable risk is an economically feasible premium. So even if you can meet all the other criteria, you're not subject to catastrophic loss. The law of large numbers applies. You're able to calculate the risk. You can measure the loss, but you come up with a premium that most people can't afford, then you have no reason to be in the business because you can't get enough customers to make money. So you're not going to make enough sales to make it worth being in the business. So if the number you come up with that would result in a profit over the long term on average is going to be too high for most people who have the risk, who face the risk to afford, then you've got a no-go product. And there's a question, of course, in some areas, flood insurance is well within economically feasible premium limits. There are many places where people could afford the premiums that they would pay even at a full risk basis. But there are many places where most people really arguably cannot afford the full risk rate. And that is where the biggest problem is probably going to lie. Some of these other criteria, we can figure out ways through reinsurance, through assigned risk plans, other means, we can figure out ways to get around those criteria and make it work. This is going to be, I think, the real toughie where we have to figure out, and we're going to have to be honest with ourselves and say, to make this work, there are going to have to be some subsidies. There will have to be wealth transfers, if you will, if we are really trying to have a big, widespread flood risk market. I'm not sure there will be any way around that. What I would ask we think about is transparency. So rather than have people subsidize other people and not know it and suddenly figure it out or discover it on their own and get very upset, I think that there's some wisdom in making sure that people know from the outset what is going on in that program and why. So that leaves us with a question: is flood risk more or less insurable than in the past when insurers were not interested in it before? And I would argue it's not more insurable than it was. It's actually less insurable than it was. And I'm not saying we can't insure it in the private market, but it is less attractive than it was before the NFIP because, frankly, now we know too much. They really didn't know before the NFIP because they were scared to cover it. They saw losses. They saw disaster assistance. They could kind of put some numbers together and think about how expensive a venture that would be if they did it. But now they have a whole model of the federal government doing this for years and years and years, and a lot of smart people applying their full-time careers to trying to make the program work within a federally subsidized program, and they haven't been able, over the long term, to make it work and keep it sustainable. And that's why they're looking at other options. So the insurance industry is looking at that saying, okay, I mean, I can tell you exactly what most of them are saying. Most of them are saying, all right, we still have modeling difficulties. So we're kind of scared of trying to model this. We're worried about whether we can predict the cost, the lost cost as well as we'd like. If we take this, kind of adopt this thing from the NFIP, we have these repetitive lost properties. Those are stinkers. You don't think the private insurance industry really wants those. So they've got to figure out what to do with those, the ones that have losses repeatedly. They're wondering, okay, the NFIP has had some good mitigation incentives in the system, but people have gamed that somewhat. And so we're dealing also with people who have failed to mitigate after having several losses. So we've got repetitive losses without mitigation. And so how do we build incentives in for people to mitigate unless we can charge exactly as high a premium as we need to signal to people what their true risk is? And then they see all this existing development in high-risk areas that wasn't there in 1968 when the NFIP program was originally established. The insurance industry's looking at that going, wow. So when we didn't want this before, Miami didn't look the way it did, that it does today. New York didn't look quite the way it does today. And certainly Florida generally didn't look the way that it does today. And they look scarier today than they did in 1968, these places. That doesn't even take into account that insurance companies in the industry and the reinsurance sector are all looking at climate change and sea level rise, and contrary to popular belief, I think they're looking at it going, whoo, this stuff looks like it could be true. And they've got, in some of these companies, their own scientists looking at those problems, trying to make predictions well out into the future, because again, insurance companies really do have a reason to take a long-term view because they make their money over the long term on average. They're statistics experts. Okay, they specialize in risk, but they know they make their money over the long term on average, so if they think that their risk is going to increase in the future, that's not going to make them more attracted to it, that's going to make them less attracted to it. So then we're left with, well, what do we do? And again, I would direct you to that GAO report that was released this January. I think it's readily available on the internet. I think you can just Google it. Talking about what we could do to privatize or to somewhat privatize or to get private-public partnership in dealing with flood insurance. And some of what is on this slide you will find in that report, and some of what's here you don't find there. But again, I was favorably impressed with what I saw them struggling with, at least in trying to deal with this problem in that report. The biggies, I think, okay, and this is my view of the world, is the insurance companies have to have the ability to assess with some level of reasonable confidence the flood risk and estimate their loss costs. So as good as models are out there, and I think there are a lot of good modelers out there doing a lot of good work, the models have to continue to improve for insurance companies to get comfortable with the risk. Again, they're information hounds. They're selling something before they know what their cost is. The better they can predict it, the more comfortable they are. They need confidence that they're going to be able to charge risk-based rates. And you think, well, don't they always charge what they want to charge? No, they don't. I live in Florida. They do not charge what they want to charge in Florida for homeowners insurance risk. So if you're even just looking at Florida, which is a high flood risk state in terms of its exposure, not necessarily in terms of its claims, but in terms of its exposures, just look at what's the experience of homeowners insurance companies are in Florida. They're not happy with how much they're able to charge in Florida. They're not confident that if they also took on flood risk, that they would necessarily be able to charge what they think they need to charge there, so that over the long run, on average, that they would make money. So I think we do need to build confidence and have regulators work together to create an environment that insurance companies view as being stable, a stable environment in which to do business. And part of that includes being able to charge to the extent feasible risk-based rates. Then, beyond that, provide some subsidies on a means basis rather than a subsidy based on grandfathering or a subsidy based on where you are. But to provide means-based subsidies, so at least we're being transparent, above board, and honest. If we don't ask everyone to pay their total risk-based rate, that we're honest about the fact that the reason some people aren't going to pay their full risk is because, you know what, they already live here, maybe they're retired, they're on fixed income, they meet a means test, and the country, if you will, and the industry recognizes we're going to have to take a little bit more in premium from other folks who might be lower risk, have more income, and help out folks who don't have as much income and really can't afford to move. Whether you're very Republican or very Democrat, whether you consider yourself very fiscally conservative or fiscally liberal, it really doesn't matter. A lot of issues in this country come down to that. And my view of it is, at least be honest about it. I'm personally not crazy about subsidies, but sometimes I see the good in them, and I just prefer full information for people paying them, as well as full information for people receiving them so that they know they're benefiting from other people. A residual market for the highest risk properties. Again, insurance companies aren't going to want to take on every risk they see. I can tell you right now, the program, the way it sits right now, insurance companies who apply to a regulator to be a private flood risk insurance seller are going to be companies who cherry pick risks that they think are right now overpriced in the NFIP program. And I don't think that really bails out the NFIP program. I don't think it achieves what the program's trying to achieve in privatization. So I think if we have insurance companies, and I don't knock them for doing it, it makes sense. If I think I can pick out properties that are overpriced in the program right now and I can charge them less, and I believe they're overpriced, then I think I have room to make money, and I'm willing to do that. If I don't think I can find overpriced properties, or I don't have confidence that what I'm finding is definitely overpriced, or I can't get a big enough market of those, then I don't want to be in that business because I'd be very nervous about whether I can make money. The residual market then would be all the highest risk stuff that really none of the private insurers see as being feasible to price out at a price that most people can afford. And then hopefully that residual market would stay as small as possible. I'm not big on subsidies. I'm also not big on government insurance programs that replace private insurance programs. So where a private market can work, I like to see it do that. So I would like to see a residual market that stays relatively small. And then adequate reinsurance capacity at affordable rates, which I already spoke about. I think that reinsurance can create stability for an insurance market that's otherwise really leery of a risk, but I think there has to be a good collaboration between reinsurers, insurers, and the government participating in this together. So again, good information back and forth between, a lot of transparency, a lot of honesty about who's covering what for what reasons, and that's entirely possible. And lastly, a focus from public policy on the affordability of reducing the underlying risk. So if we have, and I know the federal government and state governments are already trying to do this, I see the great work they do. They're trying to focus their monies and their resources on mitigation, adaptation, and education. And they end up getting caught up in a lot of other things too that aren't what their ideal focus would be. It would be fantastic if we could create a system where most of the public policy monies that end up being spent are spent toward those solutions, mitigation, adaptation, and education for homeowners in particular, but also small business owners, property owners in general who are at risk of flood. That's all I have. If anyone has questions, I'm not sure how much additional time we do have. Okay, we can take a couple if there are any. Yes?
I know you don't like, public insurance, but how do you feel about having a national catastrophe fund for all perils that are natural, like earthquake, hail, ice storms, hurricanes, and that way we don't have parts of the country complaining about Florida getting all this flood insurance relief, and if we poor Californians with whatever, are you in favor of that? Just leaving the private insurers to insure fires and thefts and trip and falls?
So I just want to make sure I understand your question so I understand what I'm answering. Do you mean a national catastrophe insurance plan that would be at a reinsurance level, or do you mean something that would be ground up for certain perils?
Just take NFIP and expand it to all natural disasters throughout.
No, I am not in favor of that. I'm not in favor of that. There's a whole market out there that does want to insure a tremendous amount of the risk that's faced in the country. And frankly, across the globe, it's becoming easier and easier to diversify the risk into other countries and from other countries to this country. So I would say at a time when private industry is more capable of diversification than it ever was in the past, I would hate to see us not take advantage of that and instead isolate our risk in our own country, having taxpayers pay for it. So I would not be in favor of a big, broad-scale national catastrophe plan that does that. I think that would become, and the biggest reason really is that I would not be convinced that it's in the long-run best interest socially for the citizens of the country. I think it would become much more expensive to implement over time than is easy to see up front.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Very good. Appreciate that. Thank you very much, Dr. Metters. I thank all our speakers. Hope you have a great night tonight, and I'll see you back in the workshops tomorrow morning.